Okay, let's start because the clock is ticking. So my name is Hugh Morgan. I'm the Vice President of Research Strategy for Infotech Research Group. And I have a very distinguished panel with me. I have Eric Openshaw, who's Vice Chairman of U.S. Technology, Media and Communications at Deloitte. And we have John Hagel, who is a distinguished author, as well as the co-chair of the Deloitte Center for the Edge. So we are talking about IoT, the Internet of Toys. And I'm only being half facetious here. Back when I was a chief technology officer of dot-coms, one of my colleagues used to call me the mayor of Toy Town because my job was so much fun. I used to buy a lot of really cool technology, and it was great. And I sort of lament the passing of that. Now, we're in an era where communication, technology is a commodity, and we're talking about utility computing, and things have gotten a little dull. So when the Internet of Things came along, I thought, oh, fantastic, the buzz is back. Toy Town's back again. And just think of the opportunities for innovation in this fantastic new market. And today we're going to explore the Internet of Things. We're going to explore the value opportunities and the ecosystem. So first question is, this is a very broad market. So perhaps start off with John. Maybe you could start off and tell us a little bit about the breadth of the market. What are the main domains, and can you give us some examples, some really cool applications?
Sure. One way of describing the Internet of Things I find useful is to talk about the history of computing as basically the whole process of making smart things smarter, Moore's Law and all that. And that the Internet of Things now is about extending that to make dumb things smarter and living things more robust. And that's the thrust of this technology in that direction. You can think about it in three broad domains. The boundaries are not always very clear or tight, but there's the consumer domain, there's the enterprise domain, and public infrastructure domain. And so there's a lot going on in all three of those. In terms of consumer, one of the areas that I'm most intrigued with, I think, in terms of the application of Internet of Things, is the whole use of biosensors to provide real-time tracking, for example, in your bloodstream of medications and how they're being distributed throughout the body, which creates an interesting opportunity for personalization of medication, so you can adjust the dosage to exactly the particular of an individual's body and how it absorbs the medication. So that's an example in the consumer space. In the enterprise space, a lot of the early applications have to do with things like being able to monitor complex machinery and be able, through watching the performance of the machinery, to anticipate potential breakdowns and provide preventive maintenance before the breakdown actually occurs. In the public infrastructure domain, a lot of interesting applications. One of them, just a simple one that has the potential to do some amazing things, which is real-time monitoring of traffic flows and feeding that information into traffic lights so that traffic lights can dynamically adjust the timing of the lights to minimize the congestion. And I would say, just as an aside, in that context, I believe one of the key implications or impacts of this technology in the city is to address the diseconomies of scale in cities. There's been a lot of work done saying that in cities you actually have superlinear performance in terms of things like innovation, a lot of good things that come with the growth of cities. Bad things come too, like congestion, pollution, and the Internet of Things, I think, has the potential to reduce those diseconomies and further drive the concentration of population in cities over time. So,
great.
I just might add to John's point, and where it's particularly fascinating to me too, is in the cities, what Barcelona is doing with traffic light control already and street light control, and what a few major metropolitan cities have done with crime prevention by real-time monitoring of incidents, as well as the data analytics that come from it to better understand where to deploy squad cars from 2 in the morning to 6 in the morning with material reductions in incidents of crime. And that's a big deal, because that's the other unintended consequence, or the tax.
Terrific. So let's talk a little bit about where the investment's going, and most significantly, where you think the opportunities are for more investment.
Well, let's start with where the investment is today. And I would say at least my primary focus is on the enterprise marketplace, that the investment is still remarkably small. There's a lot more hype and talk about Internet of Things than there is actual investment in the technology and deployment of the technology. And I think part of it is because the providers of the technology still tend to talk in tech speak without really getting down to the business case and what's in it for the enterprise in terms of adoption of this technology. By and large, you can think about enterprise economics simply as revenue, expense, and assets, and how do you impact each of those three levers, financial levers. Most of the application today of Internet of Things in the enterprise has to do with focusing on asset efficiency, reducing assets and increasing the efficiency of the assets you have. So supply chain management, the application of Internet of Things to track inventory movement, reduce your total inventory investment through efficiency and supply chain, tracking utilization of again, industrial machinery and facilities to increase the utilization rates at that level. So those tend to be the early adoption areas within the enterprise. I'd say the interesting contrast is on the consumer side. One of the interesting areas of great activity, and it's been talked about a lot in this conference as well as previous FiRe sessions, is the whole quantified self movement, the whole use of this technology in terms of tracking various aspects of your body and your wellness. And I think what's interesting is rather than us focusing on cost reduction, we're focusing on benefits as individuals, as consumers. How do we stay well and improve our wellness versus how do we cut costs? And it's a very interesting kind of divergence between enterprise focusing on cost reduction or asset efficiencies and us as individuals saying, wow, this technology actually can achieve incredible benefits for us in terms of wellness.
I was going to add, I think that while it has been about assets and supply chain, there are certain big plays that we've been observing of late that have the opportunity to not only improve asset efficiency, but significantly impact the top line. John and I were in a workshop that we held at MIT Media Labs a few weeks ago, and someone made the offhanded snide, well, I don't need a sensor in my Diet Coke can. We happen to have someone, a very senior person from a very large beverage company in the room, and said, well, actually, maybe not in the Coke can itself, but we certainly are about ready to go big in every single machine we have and every truck. We run a fleet of 270,000 vehicles in 126 countries around the world. And our biggest opportunity for revenue improvement is to avoid stockouts in vending machines and small stores. And we believe sensors on the store shelf, sensors in the vending machine will have a material impact to both our top line and bottom line.
Interesting. Now, we haven't talked about the public infrastructure. Where's the investment there, and what are the big opportunities?
Again, I think in broad strokes, the bulk of the investment and overall observation, not as much investment as the hype would suggest. We're still at a very early stage in terms of deployment of the technology, but it's largely around efficiency applications, how to increase energy efficiency, increase various decrease costs in the public infrastructure, and so that's where most of the activity is today.
And what are the opportunities?
Opportunities are huge. I mean, I think that one of the key messages we have to companies, to enterprises, is that if you expand your horizons and think more broadly about where this technology can have impact, one of the relatively neglected sides, Eric gave an example in terms of revenue improvement, but the whole notion of how to use this to drive revenue growth is an untapped area for most enterprises. And it involves, from our perspective, moving from when we talk with executives about revenue improvement, they tend to think about things like, oh, I can target people much more effectively because I know their presence next to a shelf that has my product on it, which is still a very transactional mindset. How do I push more products to the unsuspecting consumer? And our sense is the real opportunity around this technology is to move from transactions to relationships with consumers, and to have a much deeper understanding of the context within which consumers actually use the products and services that we're delivering, and create insight about unmet needs, opportunities to add more products and services to address the unmet needs of the consumer. Very different kind of mindset and big opportunity available to companies. This is all ultimately one way of framing this technology. It's about context awareness, real-time context awareness. There's other opportunity. If you think about the way this technology is being deployed today, it's basically around what I would describe as exception handling. I have an unexpected problem in my inventory supply chain. I need real time to identify that exception and address it. And certainly that's very important and helpful. But there's a second order opportunity, which is to step back and look at patterns of exceptions over time and say, why did those exceptions emerge? And are there certain exceptions that are emerging with increasing frequency? Because if that's happening, now I have an opportunity to step back and innovate at the process or product level to say, how could I redesign my process to reduce those kinds of exceptions? Or redesign my product to improve its performance. If it's breaking down in certain ways, in certain contexts with increasing frequency, how would I redesign the product to make that function more effectively? And then finally, a third level of opportunity, which at the end of the day we think is probably the biggest opportunity, is to move from optimization to disruption with this technology. Think about this technology not just as a way to generate some incremental revenue, reduce some incremental cost, but how would you disrupt a market or industry using this technology? And again, I'll go back to one of my favorite examples of the quantified self movement and the use of Internet of Things in that context. My belief is that has the potential to fundamentally disrupt the healthcare industry. By doing an end run on the edge, focusing on wellness rather than initially disease.
Be nice to put doctors out of business, wouldn't it?
And I think it comes back into, okay, now I've got a disease and using these platforms and technologies to help me get better faster. But in the process, disrupting the very conventional healthcare industry, which is disease treatment, come to me when you have a disease, as opposed to, I want to help make you well and even better.
So this idea of pattern recognition becomes increasingly important as we move from a society of ownership to rentership of Airbnb and autonomous vehicles that we'll probably want to use by the drink or by the mile or the hour, not necessarily own. Understanding the patterns of usage of where are those assets and what is their condition and where do they need to get to if they're movable becomes pretty important to improving the utilization frequency. MIT would tell us in the autonomous car world that there is the possibility, if we decided to go to a rent versus own, the average car, I think somebody said earlier, was a 1.5 hour a day experience for most of us. That means 22.5 hours an asset sits idle. Not unlike the Airbnb model. Well, it's important to know where that asset is if we're going to move it from your driveway to my driveway when you're done with it. And likewise, if you look at cities and the borrow a bike model for a Euro in Paris and the like, it's important to know where the bike ended up so that you can understand patterns of usage. Go pick that bike up at the end of the night, move it back to where it needs to be the next day. And this is where, you get asset efficiency, but you also get a huge lift in service utilization, customer satisfaction, and ultimately revenue.
But what a disruptive model for automobile
Well, absolutely,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And look at other product categories where you can move from a purchase to a rental model and dramatically increase the efficiency of use of the products and the process. I think, going to disrupt a lot of industries over time.
So we've talked a lot about value. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about the ecosystem. So maybe, John, you could give us sort of an end-to-end view of what are the different components of the ecosystem that make the Internet of Things work?
Well, I often describe the current state of the Internet of Things as the equivalent of the early days of the personal computer, when you had lots of vertically integrated technology stacks being deployed that couldn't talk to each other. And that the real value ultimately of this is there's obviously the device level. There is the issue of how do you connect those devices, how do you aggregate the data that's emerging from those connected devices, how do you do the analytics on that data, and then how do you actually take action to increase performance in various dimensions. And at the end of the day, our belief is that ultimately the way we're going to really unleash the value of the Internet of Things is by going through the kind of transition we went through in the PC industry, where we moved from vertical stacks to a set of horizontal layers where there was connectivity and ability to communicate across vendors so that you could aggregate the data and do the analytics around it. So part of this is a set of standards and protocols that will help to facilitate that connectivity and connection. But the other piece, I think, is then an ecosystem that can emerge around analytics on the data. And one of my great examples here, it's not Internet of Things, but I think the lesson could potentially be applied here, is the famous case of Goldcorp, the gold mining company in Canada, that one day decided to release all the data, the geological data about one of its mines, and invited geologists and anybody who wanted to come in and offer ideas as to how to more efficiently explore that mine to get more gold out of it. They offered, I think, about a $500,000 prize to the person who came up with the most interesting approach. They ended up generating about $3 billion of new gold coming out of that mine. Not a bad return on investment, 500,000, $3 billion. But the interesting thing about Goldcorp was this was a one-time event. They released the data for a period of time, they offered the prize, somebody got the prize, then it closed it down and moved on. I think one of the interesting things with the Internet of Things is creating platforms where analytics, third-party analytics, can come in and look at data sets and provide continuing insight and advice. Again, I think going back to quantified self, the opportunity for, as we aggregate more and more data about our physical condition, to have third-party analytics to come in and offer advice is going to be a very powerful way to harness more value from this technology. It obviously has all kinds of issues in terms of the rights to the data and the ability to manage the data. I think another example just in that context that is not enterprise but in the public infrastructure is what Code for America is doing in terms of taking data from various government agencies and entities, working with the government to expose that data, and then inviting third-party analytics to come in and develop analysis, applications around the data to create more value from the data. So a lot of opportunity as we move to thinking more about an ecosystem than about just individual vendors pushing their products to the customer.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts following on John's. One is this idea of standardization does become important, but at what level? And we're starting to think that the dumber these devices can be kept at the sensor level, the higher the probability is we'll get more connectivity in the layers of the stack going up. We've become recently very interested in the Industrial Internet Consortium and wanting to participate in that to see if we can help drive some of the thinking around how we make sure these stay open platforms and the ecosystems evolve appropriately.
Great. So do you see anybody emerging as a leader in the horizontalization, I guess, for lack of a better word, of the ecosystem, or are we still in silos?
You know, again, Code for America in the public infrastructure space would probably be an interesting example. Our sense is this is still a very large white space, both in
So lots of opportunities for
enterprise and
people who want to
consumer. Yes.
play in this space.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about bottlenecks then, because I think in the ecosystem we probably would acknowledge that there are some potential issues here. So let's talk about bandwidth as one of them. I mean, if we've got a gazillion devices out there competing with movies on demand and everything all over a very limited set of pipes, wireless bandwidth, what's going to happen?
I think we have a group working on that in the next room, don't we?
I think we might.
Isn't that the CTO challenge this year?
Well, certainly part of it. Anyway.
Certainly for the security and privacy dimensions of this, which is a big issue. And frankly, again, looking at the enterprise marketplace, I'd say one of the big factors holding back decision makers in the enterprise space around more aggressive investment in this technology is the issue of security. I mean, you're exposing some potentially very valuable data and providing potentially access to operations of your business in ways that could be highly destructive.
Well, I love Vince Cerf's analogy, the 100,000 refrigerators
refrigerators
starting to attack the Bank of America.
Yeah. So
the privacy side is important too, though. We can't understate that. I want a better way to work, but I don't want the insurance company to know that I speed between traffic lights either. So I want a better experience, but I also want to have some amount of anonymity in there, and so.
Well, and I guess when you have the health insurance companies start to get involved in personal wellness, there's going to be an argument about who owns the data too.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about security then. I mean, what is being done to protect the data that flows along the wireless networks and into the databases? I mean, are there any steps being taken, any standards emerging?
It's still very early stage. I mean, our sense is that, again, individual vendors are starting to tackle the security question for their particular devices and the data generated in that device. But this whole question of as these things become connected, and particularly if they connect across vendors, technology, what's the security approach then? How do you protect the ecosystem as opposed to just the individual vendors' offers? And again, I'm hopeful that the CTO challenge will shed some
Solve
light
this
on
problem.
that.
Right. Eric, any thoughts on anything emerging that you've seen?
No, I think we still, lots of encryption going on, a lot of bright minds thinking about this, but I haven't seen anything that yet knocks my socks off to say, okay, we've licked it. A lot of it is a leap of faith around I'll share and hopefully I'll remain somewhat anonymous.
And I would say, too, that certainly as you think about how this is likely to unfold, this whole notion, which was talked about yesterday in a couple of sessions at least, this whole notion of security as perimeter control becomes less and less tenable. I mean, what's the perimeter in an Internet of Things where all these devices are connected and sharing data? It becomes a much more, it requires a very different, I think, approach to security than the traditional one.
So let's talk a little bit about data analytics, because you brought this up as a very powerful tool. And I have a little bit of experience in this area where I was involved with a project to do smart metering, and there were 5 million meters being read every 15 minutes. And the big data problem was quite daunting with the technology of the current era. Do you think we're going to drown in data once we start collecting this?
Well, that's certainly a possibility, but I think that part of what's going on now is the sorting out of where does the data really need to be and how much of that data that's collected, as one of the speakers up here earlier was talking about the smartphone as a platform, collecting from a smartwatch, glass, and the like, and how much of that data moves from a very local network called your breast pocket to some broader network called the internet, and is it moving at a summarized level or somewhat detailed level? So I think a lot of that's sorting out. We tend to look at the total data right now as, oh my God, that can't all go on the internet. It probably doesn't have to.
Right. We're just under the 5-minute mark, so if anybody is interested in asking questions, please come up to the mics. So what about the actual big data tools? Are we equipped with, with Hadoop and NoSQL and so on? Are we actually equipped with the tools at the database level to analyze all this information?
I'm not a data scientist, so that's a better question of a data scientist than me.
John?
Yeah, I'm not a data scientist either. I do think that it is the area for innovation is the analytic tools. It's the collection and the aggregation of the data is certainly challenging in its own right, but the real value is going to come from the analysis and moving from what I would say today is largely a descriptive analysis, describing the context as it exists in real time, to predictive analytics, and then ultimately to prescriptive analytics, where you're taking what's likely to happen and giving very specific direction to either other machines or people to come in and address that in a way that's going to create more value.
So lots of ecosystem problems to work on by the sound of it. Okay, first question.
Brad Holt, Scion Research. Most of what you're talking about, I really appreciate the discussion about the ecosystem and the stacks required. But most of what you're talking about are first order effects of bringing IoT on board. There's a whole slew of second order effects, particularly when we can make the round trip back to design and manufacturing. It's not so much about maintaining the machine in the field, but understanding how that design and manufacturing needs to be changed over time. And if you take that same step and look at second order effects in healthcare, it's not so much about the individual healthcare of one person, but if you can disaggregate that information and combine it and get epidemiological data across all of this, you get really game-changing things. IoT sounds like Internet of Toys, but it is such a transformative opportunity that I would say, instead of thinking of us as PCs in 1980, I think we're much more like the Internet in 1985.
Fair enough.
I agree with you.
Yeah.
Next question.
Nelson Heller Results. I hope this isn't a question with a one-word answer, but are any of you aware of any IoT applications in education, kindergarten through university level?
You know, that's a great question. I've personally.
Uh-oh, I suspect the answer is
Yeah.
no.
But, well, we might not give you an answer now, but we can give you an answer later today. One of our colleagues, John Seeley Brown, is particularly passionate about this topic of education. And no doubt he is aware of many because he's extremely involved in K through 12.
Yeah.
Is he going to be here? Or you
No,
gonna ask him?
no, but
We'll
if
have
you
to do a phone call.
catch me at the next break and we'll help you with that.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Jim Lauterbach. So Joe Chow from Cisco says the Internet of Everything is going to be 50 billion devices in 2020, 500 billion devices in 2030. The heck are we going to do with all that data, and where are we going to put it all?
Good question.
Question.
No, and to trump Cisco, there's another analyst who's actually predicted 1 trillion devices within a reasonable period of time. So the whole question of the architectures required to support trillions of devices is a really interesting one. And I think at the end of the day is going to require us to step back and rethink architectures, IT architectures at a fundamental level, because you cannot handle that complexity if you treat it as a purely top-down architectural exercise. So a lot of requirement to challenge traditional architectural principles.
Eric, anything to add?
No, I think John nailed it. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Any further questions? So we have about 15 seconds left, so I think we may declare it over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, panelists.